Knights, damsels in distress, castles, they trigger our imagination. A lot of books and movies have been made about the Middle Ages, and that is no surprise, because this is a very interesting time period. But who am I? I'm just a history teacher. Every time period is interesting for me. Anyway, the next few weeks we are going to learn about the Dark Ages, a fascinating era. We will get to know Charlemagne and his feudal system. We will discover the story behind tournaments for knights, and we will understand more about the spread of Christianity, and finally, we are going to discuss Vikings. So sit back and learn. Let's start with looking at a timeline. Yeah, timelines. So when did these Middle Ages took place? Let's go to slide 2. Look at the middle of the timeline. You can see that it says de tijd van monniken en ridders. In English that would be the time of monks and knights. And this lasted from 500 after Christ until 1000 after Christ. This is what we will discuss in this chapter, chapter 5. So the Romans are before this era and the late Middle Ages are after. So you can recognize this chapter by the symbol with the small helmet. And let's continue. So in the next few weeks we will learn about monks and knights. And just as always we will start with 5.1. So on this slide you can see some of the most important words of 5.1. So why don't you look at it and try to figure out if you already know something about this. Alright, on slide 4 we look back on what we already know. The Roman Empire came to an end. But how did this go? This map gives us a lot of information. Thank you, map. It's the year 450 after Christ. It was Attila who chased the Germanic tribes, such as the Franks and the Visigoths, across the border into the Roman Empire. This is called the Great Migration Period. And I mean period as a moment in time, not like the end of a sentence. But well, it was the end of a sentence, so period. Anyway, when you look at the map, you can see that every arrow represents another tribe or people that moved to another place. Imagine how strange this is, hundreds of thousands of people moving around in Europe. On slide 5 we can see the end of Rome. Germanic tribes attacked the Romans again and again, and in 476 they destroyed the city and the Western Roman Empire was defeated. The Eastern Roman Empire lasted for another 1000 years. So what happened with Europe after the Romans? Let's go to slide 6. The Great Migration period caused a lot of trouble. The Middle Ages started with hundreds of years of war and unrest. There was fighting and killing for almost 300 years, between 500 AD and 800 AD. Imagine that this is a very chaotic class and there is no teacher, or the teacher doesn't have any strict rules. This will cause unrest, noise and distraction. Pupils could even fight against each other to try and see who's the strongest. This is how Europe was after the Romans lost their power. There were no rules and nobody was boss. But this changed around the year 800. Look at slide 8. When people are fighting, there's always one who's strongest. Well, the Christian Franks were the strongest during the Middle Ages. They conquered big parts of Western Europe. Look at the map. A big part of this is the current country that we know as France. And that's also where this country gets its name from. France, Franks, easy peasy. Let's continue to slide 8. The Franks were the most powerful people in Europe around 800 and Charlemagne was their king. In Dutch we would call him Karel de Grote. Charlemagne was a mighty ruler who changed the Middle Ages. He brought order and peace. He also spread Christianity, made people use coins again, ordered beautiful buildings to be built, and he wanted children to go to school. Charlemagne is also nicknamed the Father of Europe. On slide 9 you can see that he was so powerful that he was crowned emperor in the year 800. He was seen as the successor of the Roman Empire, 300 years after its fall. Charlemagne didn't like that the Pope crowned him, because it showed that the Pope was more powerful than him, and this made Charlemagne very angry. So Charlemagne is a very important person in this section, And one of the most important concepts is the feudal system. And this is what you can see on slide 10. Charlemagne's empire was so big, but this also caused a problem, because he couldn't rule the empire by himself. Charlemagne solved this by inventing the feudal system. He divided his land among his friends, and these friends were called vassals, and they ruled his land for him. The only thing Charlemagne did was traveling around to check them, and this feudal system might be a little bit complicated, but we'll learn about this step by step. On slide 11 you can see a simple diagram. You can see that the emperor is at the top. He is the most powerful, but he can't rule this land by himself. That's why he splits it up into smaller parts. His vassals get a part to rule for him. But for them it is still too big. That's why they also split it up. And they also give land to their vassals. The peasants or farmers are at the bottom. They have to work the land and pay taxes. So many companies and schools are still organized a little bit like this. There's a principal at the top of our school, but he or she can't do it alone. That's why there are team leaders, such as Miss van der Wel. Even team leaders can't do everything by themselves, so they have teachers and mentors. The students are at the bottom. But in our situation, the students are actually the most important. Let's zoom in a little bit more. Let's go to slide 12. So the emperor is the most powerful man in Europe, because he owns all his land and he is named Lord. Everybody who sees him has to say, "Yes, my lord," "No, my lord," etc. But when we click further, we can see that he gives his land to the vassals, and the high vassals are called dukes. In Dutch we would say hertog. They rule a part of the land, but they also have to listen to their lord, the emperor. But these dukes are also lords themselves, because they also have vassals. They give their land to people that are called counts, and in Dutch we would say graaf. Isn't that a nice word, count? Do you know Graaf Tel from Sesame Street? In English he is called Count, because he is count and he counts all the time. Anyway, these counts are not that powerful, but they still rule the land and the farmers on it. So these farmers or peasants have to work all day. They are like half-free slaves. They have to work for their lord and pay taxes. So on slide 16 you can see that the vassals and their lords made important agreements. For example, the lord had a task to protect his or her vassals. The vassals had the task to rule the piece of land and help the lord during wars and pay taxes. That's what they had to do. So what did the lord get? He got taxes and help from his vassals. And what did the vassals get? They get a piece of land and protection from their lord. So this is how this system works. They could both benefit if they followed the rules and the agreement. On slide 17 you can see that the vassals had to swear to follow their lord. This oath of loyalty was very important. It was an honor to fight for your lord. When you would not do what your lord said, and if you would break your oath, well, that was a big disgrace. The shame would be worse than death, because your children and their children would also suffer from your disloyalty. Well, Charlemagne didn't live forever. On slide 18 we can see that he passed away in the year 814, and his empire was split up by his sons. It fell apart, and this is the start of modern-day France and Germany. The middle part eventually breaks apart into different smaller countries. Let's go to slide 19. The death of Charlemagne made an end to a time of peace. It was the start of another chaotic time full of war. The vassals wanted to take the power and land for themselves, and they started to fight against each other. Everybody wanted more and more and more. So they used their armies of knights to fight, and they gave their land from father to son. During Charlemagne's life, the land didn't stay in the family, but was given to those who were strong and loyal to the emperor. Now the vassals felt that the land was theirs to keep. We will learn more about knights in a moment, but it's interesting to see that knights changed during the years. You can look at the pictures and see that their armor got better. We click on slide 20. The vassals or knights protected their land from a castle or a stronghold. This is where they and the villagers could hide during wars. The vassals built these castles to improve their power. The stronger the castle, the more difficult it is to chase the lord away. The castles also got bigger throughout the ages. You can find beautiful castles in France, Germany, Spain, England, and Scotland. The vassals in the Netherlands were not strong enough to build big castles, except for the Muiderslot. That's one example of a Dutch castle. On slide 21 you can see that it was very difficult to take over a castle. Let's take a look at this picture of a siege and find out what we see. Alright, that's enough time to look at the picture. Let's continue to slide 24 and let's delve more into these fascinating knights. One of the most famous knights is the man that you can see on the picture in the left corner. His name is King Arthur, and according to ancient legends, he ruled England during the early Middle Ages. Arthur got famous because of his Knights of the Round Table and his magical sword called Excalibur. According to the story, he pulled a magical sword from the stone, and that is how he became king. According to the story, he lived in a castle named Camelot, and he got help from a wizard called Merlin. Well, Arthur had many adventures and is known as a very good king. You can look up his adventures in books or movies that are made about him. One very sad story is that his wife, Guinevere, was secretly in love with his best friend, Lancelot. And Lancelot loves her back. When Arthur hears that his wife has an affair with his best friend, he gets really sad. So we don't really know for certain if Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table really existed, but we do know that there were many other knights. So the question is, what are knights? Well, a knight is a soldier from the Middle Ages, and a knight wears armor and fights on the back of a horse. They are like old versions of tanks. But knights also had other tasks besides fighting. So what did they do? Well, the first thing they did was they ruled the land of their lord. So a vassal, like a count or a duke, is also a knight. They would also maintain order, as if they were police. So if there was a fight or there was some argument in the village or in the city, they would be the police. They would also collect taxes, and they of course fought in the army. So they were both tax collector, soldier, police, all these tasks is what they did. Let's continue to slide 26. An example of a knight that collects taxes is the story of Robin Hood. Robin is not a knight himself. He is a robber who steals from the rich and gives money to the poor. The rich sheriff of Nottingham is a knight and he takes money from the poor. And Robin and his friends disagree with this. So in his stories, he steals money from the sheriff of Nottingham because he steals it from the poor. His stories are very interesting. You should look it up, movies, books, all kinds of fascinating things about Robin Hood. An interesting thing about knights is that they organized tournaments. They came together to joust. The goal of a joust is to ride on the back of a horse and use a lance or spear to push the other knight off his horse. And the knight who remains in his seat wins. So sometimes they fought with swords or other weapons, and in these tournaments the knight could show their strength. So the goal wasn't to kill anyone, but you can imagine what kind of terrible accidents you can get when you fall off your horse or get a spear in your neck or in your eye. So during this Middle Ages, most knights agreed to a certain code. They followed the rules of the Code of Chivalry. This meant that they had to behave in a nice and orderly way. They had to protect the weak and were not allowed to kill unarmed people, and they had to speak in a polite fashion. They also tried to steal the hearts of damsels or ladies. This is called courtly love. Knights fought each other to win the heart of a woman they loved, and they wrote love poems, made music, and were sweet and friendly. Some rude boys at our school could learn from this, I guess. So ladies were not allowed to become knights. They had to work on their embroidery, pray. Only farmers' wives were like equal to men. They also had to work the land. Let's go to slide 30. So in castles and other old buildings, most of the time you can find shields with symbols on it. Well, every noble family had a shield like this. It was called a coat of arms. Not a real coat of arms, not like you wear a coat of arms, that would be really strange. But these noble families had their own symbols and colors, such as a lion on a red background or a unicorn with gold. These coats of arms made it possible to recognize a knight during a battle, and study of these symbols is called heraldry. So some last quick facts. Did you know that Japanese samurai were also some kind of knights? They fought for their emperor and protected them with their life and honor. There were even female warriors in Japan, such as Tomu Gozen, who fought her enemies with a katana, a big samurai sword. So we came to the end of this section, 5.1, and there's a lot of more to tell about Charlemagne, knights, and castles. There are so many stories to tell about medieval heroes. Maybe you can look up a nice book or a movie about knights. I think that you will really enjoy it.